Okay, good day, Life Group leaders and friends. We're on session 4. That's on page 36, talking about Jeremiah in chapter 12 and his discussion with God. A little background, as we know from the sessions before, Jeremiah was a young man handpicked by God before he was born, and he was picked to be a prophet and to speak to the southern kingdom of Judah, which he did, but unfortunately the message he brought wasn't well received by the people, so much so that they tried to get rid of him. We'll find that coming up in future lessons. But to begin in chapter 12, we really need to back up to get a little bit of the backstory in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is really where it kind of starts this conversation, this dialogue with God, and it's interesting that he points out, and one of the first takeaways is that we can have a personal relationship with God and speak and ask and even share, like Jeremiah did, share our fears, our frustrations, some concerns, and he did that. But I want to start out in chapter 11. I would recommend you do that. There's a couple of key verses there that point us to today's lesson. In fact, chapter 11, verse 3, God says, "Tell them that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Cursed is the man who does not obey the terms of this covenant." So we know there was a covenant relationship all the way back with their forefathers, and there in Deuteronomy we talk about the blessings and curses, and so there are blessings that God wanted to provide if the people followed and obeyed his commands, but there were consequences if they didn't, and that's these curses he talked about. And that's what Jeremiah's message was to the people, that they needed to start following God. But again, like I'd mentioned, they didn't like his message, and he actually came from a pretty small town. I think the name was Anathoth, if I pronounce that correctly, and was I think his dad was a priest, and the people of his hometown and family and turned against him, and they didn't like the message so much that they plotted to kill him. And we know from our first lesson several weeks ago that God had promised to protect him. In fact, God revealed, it says in verse 18 of chapter 11, "Because the Lord revealed the plot to me, I knew it, and he showed what they were going to do." And he felt like, he says, I had been like a gentle lamb led to slaughter. And so that reminds me of even John the Baptist, who announced Jesus as the lamb of God. So a little bit of a foreshadowing there of Jesus there. When I saw that, he felt like he was a lamb led to slaughter. And when that was revealed to him, obviously it must have been very frustrating. And in verse 20, "But Lord, O God, you who judge righteously and test the heart and mind, let me see your vengeance upon them." So he is basically wasn't going to take matters in his own hands, but he wanted God's vengeance upon those who were plotting against him. And that's kind of the backdrop to this chapter 12, where we're starting today in our lesson in verse 1. So we see that they wanted to kill him. Jeremiah was expecting more of an immediate vengeance, or for God to avenge the wrongs that those were against him. And he asked the question that we've all asked, I think, if we were honest with ourselves. Well, why do the wicked seem to prosper? What is it about the people who are evildoers that seem like life goes good for them, and we as Christians sometimes suffer and have issues and situations that are difficult to understand? And he asked that question. Verses 1 through 4, he really said, "You are righteous, O God. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease?" And that question, it's not the first time someone had asked that question. You may remember Job asked the same question, and then Asaph, I think, is in Psalm 73. I'll refer you to that, and you might want to look at that. Verse 3 of Psalm 73 says, "For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." And if you read on in that Psalms, what you might want to do, even though God didn't directly answer Jeremiah when he asked, the answer did come in Psalms. It says, "When I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive to me till I entered the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their destiny." And so the answer that we know, God works on his own timetable, and he will avenge, and there is a reward for those who obey and follow and accept him. That's called eternal security, but there is a negative consequence for those who reject him, and that's what the people of Judah were doing, was rejecting God's teachings. And again, Jeremiah was asking, why do bad people seem to prosper? Why do wicked people seem to thrive? And like I mentioned, God did not give him a direct answer, but he did answer. And his answer really in verses 5 and 6, he talked about, he basically, in the way I would say it, he kind of said, "Jeremiah, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you can't handle a little bit of opposition from your family in this small town, how are you going to be able to handle much greater opposition and rejection of my message when you go to Jerusalem and the crowds are larger who are against you?" So he reminded Jeremiah that the message he was delivering wasn't necessarily the one that the people wanted to hear. In fact, they were hearing from the false prophets that everything was good, and that Jeremiah was the one who was the false prophet teaching gloom and doom, and they didn't want to hear that. So again, the plot was against him, and they rejected that message. So I did listen to a good sermon on Jeremiah chapter 12, and the gentleman presenting the message there had several takeaways. I was impressed with them. I want to share those with you, and you might want to use these in your group, because after verse 6, when you go through verse 7 through the rest of the chapter, God gets very specific in the type of consequences that he was going to bring in his own timing, not necessarily in Jeremiah's timing, but in his timing on the children of Israel, the southern nation of Judah. So point number one that the gentleman shared was, like I'd already mentioned, and there's daily application. I want to mention that too. There's application for us today with what Jeremiah was facing. We also face in our nation. So point number one, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get worse. And that's what God was saying to him. It definitely could get worse. So one of the sayings I've adopted here recently is expect the unexpected. So if we realize that things going to happen in life and to us and maybe in our nation that were completely unexpected, but it is getting worse, seems like. Point number two says, as you get more opportunity to share the gospel, the opposition to you and your message will escalate. And that's exactly what happened to Jeremiah, that his opportunities to share to larger audiences and crowds and in front of as the people were coming to worship in the temple, and he was given that sermon that that is prior to chapter 12 and prior to 11. The people did not like that message, and the opposition definitely escalated. Point number 3 that he made was, it would be good to train now for the trial you are not yet in. So we know that even though things may seem to go good one day, things can change real quickly in the future. So be prepared and train for the things that could. And we think our nation, some of the, again, takeaways, our current nation, the situation we're in, probably will get worse, not better. Point number 4 he made was, God will put to use what he put you through. And we know that from experience. That's a lot of our testimony, is what God has has helped us through, that we, with His strength and help, have survived the past issues and trials and tribulations. And speaking of strength, point number 5 says, your strength will fail, but God's strength will never fail. And I was reminded of Philippians 4:17, and Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it wasn't his strength, but he relied on God's strength. So, a couple more thoughts here. We know in verses 7 through 13 of our lesson, God details, again, the consequences he's going to bring upon the children of Israel there, the tribe of Judah, southern kingdom. I'm not going to read all those verses. You can kind of go through those, and there's some good symbolism there in some of the verses. So that would be good to discuss in your lesson. But the so what, or the takeaway, I see a lot of similarity between what Jeremiah was facing, the rejection, the idol worship. The people were caught up in that, unbelievable, and I don't understand how they could be so committed to the false idols and not be committed to the one true God. But that's what we see over and over again. But we see that in America today, in kind of the State of the Union. Sadly, June has been named Pride Month. We see the idol worship of some of the things going on, and even the boycotts of companies, and it seems like our country is so torn apart by different beliefs, different attitudes, and evil wickedness. And same thing that Jeremiah was saying, and you might want to get into a little bit of discussion about that, to say that like God instructed Jeremiah, he also is instructing us. We're going to be strong and courageous and bold, and be willing to tell the truth and share the truth regardless of the opposition to our message and to the good news. So that's what I would recommend, that you spend a little bit of time on how can we stay strong and not wilt under pressure, but be strong and depend on God's strength to help us, even though a large group of people may reject the message. It's our responsibility to tell the good news, like it was Jeremiah's responsibility. So a few thoughts to share today on that, just a few takeaways. Maybe those 5 points there will be some for discussion, so hopefully that'll help. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Hope you have a good rest of your week and a good class. Thank you.